Hey everybody, welcome back to Ask BirdGuy. I'm Matthew Daughter, Executive Director of Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and I'd like to talk today about one of my favorite topics, which is fall warblers. We're at the beginning of fall migration, and this is now in the middle of August. We've seen a number of shorebirds come through, and they'll continue to come through for the next few weeks or a month or so. Some of them will remain, and some of them will continue farther south. But the next big wave of migrants will probably be some of the passerines, and among them will be some of our warblers. So in this video, I'd like to talk about 4, 5, 6 of our most common warblers, and a few places where you can go to look for them. So I'm looking forward to talking about it. Buckle up and get ready, because we're going to get right into it. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with fall warblers. I grew up in Boston, and my first field guide was this tiny little book. And it certainly wasn't complete, and it didn't tell me very much about the birds I was seeing, but still it was a start. I moved up to the Peterson Eastern Guide, which was so much better than that first little guide because it had all the birds. After that, I moved to the Golden Guide, and the Golden Guide and all those other guides conspired to convince me that there simply were no warblers in the West. They were an Eastern phenomenon, and they were beautiful and colorful, but if you go east of the Rockies, forget about it. No warblers at all. But we know from looking at the checklist, this is the Northern California checklist, but these results are reflected in our Santa Clara Valley checklist. You see, there are tons of warblers in the West, and those slightly darker orange species are the ones that we normally think of as sort of eastern warblers. So why are they here? Let's talk about one of the more common vagrant warblers that we get in Northern California, the blackpoll warbler. So you see here that it really isn't an eastern species at all, but its migration takes it over the East Coast and the Midwestern states. But there are a couple things to notice here. One is that the spring northward bound and the fall southward bound journeys are different. Also see how the general orientation, the general direction of the migration is from northwest to southeast. So imagine for a second if you place a mirror right in the middle of that range, going north to south. What happens to that route, that southbound route? It's going to be reflected on the west coast. And that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. That is called mirror misorientation. It's the idea that the birds on our west coast, the ones that we consider eastern birds, are not really lost at all. They simply have misoriented. Their navigation system is working, it's just sort of working backwards. This idea was floated by Dave DeSanti in the early 90s, late 80s, I think. And he wrote his entire thesis about mirror misorientation to explain why so many eastern birds are found in the West during fall migration. We might note that they're not really found here during spring migration. Spring migration is usually more direct and more hurried. Fall migration is often a little bit more protracted, and there are a lot of brand new birds, very young birds, that are making that journey for the first time. So anyway, lots of things to think about. But mirror misorientation explains and verifies that there are lots of eastern warblers on the west coast during fall. So it wasn't until the National Geographic Field Guide came out that they started to hint at migration routes, and that idea was continued onto all of the 7 editions of the field guide. And we can see in the most recent guide that there are many, many suggestions of where birds go during migration, where they appear. It isn't simply red for summer and blue for winter. We now have yellow in the middle. to tell us where the birds generally migrate. And that's very, very helpful. Since those books have come out, there have been a number of other books that focus really on warblers. The Peterson Field Guide to Warblers, John Dunn and Kimball Garrett, exceptional book. The Donald and Lillian Stokes Field Guide to Warblers, also pretty wonderful. Very small book. And most recently, the Warbler Guide, which is fantastic. I highly recommend it. It's available at our nature shop, and you will not be sorry. It's a dense book. It's got a lot of information in it, but it is truly wonderful. It will show you a number of views of each bird, and the little icons along the upper edge of the left page here help to describe where the bird is found in the tree. Does it have any particular habits that we should be aware of? And what's the overall coloration of the bird, top to bottom, dorsal and ventral? They also offer a really wonderful app for your smartphone, which will give you three-dimensional views of the warblers and play the songs if you'd like to hear those. This shot from the Warbler Guide describes or pinpoints the areas that you really want to pay attention to when you see a warbler. Keep in mind that a lot of warblers are going to be overhead in the upper branches of the trees, so you're frequently getting a look just like this from below. It's unfortunate, but sometimes that's the best we can do. Every single warbler in our area, all 55, 56 warblers in the ABA, can be identified from a view like this. You don't even see the face, you can't see the back, but they're still identifiable. So it's a good idea to get used to some of these things: the throat, the breast, the belly, the vent, the undertail, the tail. So think about those. When you see a warbler, try to get as much of this information as you can. Either jot it down or say it out loud. I do this all the time. I'm looking at a bird and I will say out loud, oh, it has a yellow throat, a white belly, I see streaks on the side. The reason I do that is because it helps me remember. I can remember stuff that I hear sometimes better than I can remember things that I think. So say those field marks out loud to yourself or to your friend, and help yourself remember them. Repeat them if that's helpful. Get a look at that tail, the undertail coverts and the color of the tail itself. Is it dark? Is it light? Is the undertail yellow or is it white? Get a sense of that and you will divide the number of possibilities in half right away. Think about where you see the tree. Now, granted, birds will show up in habitats that probably differ from their breeding habitats, but they're likely to behave much the same. So if you're dealing with a skulker like McGillivray's warbler, you'll probably find that low in the trees or the bushes or possibly even on the ground before you'll find it in the upper branches. So that behavior is probably consistent. That preference for a given elevation within a tree or a shrub is probably the same from breeding to wintering. But you might not expect to find the bird in the specific habitat because the habitat between breeding range, wintering range, and migration is probably very different. Most importantly, think about what the bird is doing. Is it spreading its tail? Is it fly catching? Is it hovering? Is it climbing on the trunk, or is it walking on the ground? Does it bob its tail? Those are all fabulous things to notice. They're very important because most of those behaviors are distinctive. So get a sense of what it's doing, where it is in the tree, and all the features that we just talked about, the undertail, the tail spots, etc. These confusing fall warblers have traditionally been divided into two major categories: those with wing bars and those without. If you look at Peterson's Field Guide, which is wonderful because it does highlight these two large areas, it groups the wing bars and streaks into one category and the unstreaked and plain-winged birds in another category. Now, if you can decide which of these two large groups your bird goes into, you are so far toward identifying it. So the Stokes Guide lays out behavior and field marks really, really well on this 2-page spread here. So I highly recommend this little book if you can find it. But if not, keep in mind the Warbler Guide has got this information as well. Your Field Guide has got this information, but it's not always laid out quite as nicely as this. First up is orange-crowned warbler. This is a pretty common breeding bird in our area. It's less common during winter, but it's usually pretty easy to find during fall. So this is a relatively drab warbler. It's during breeding season quite bright yellow, but not nearly as bright as yellow warbler. It has often kind of a grayish, greenish yellow cast and faint streaks on the breast. You may or may not be able to see that, but the facial pattern is pretty interesting. It has a very, very faint eye stripe and faint eye crescents. So it does have a facial pattern that you can pick out and differentiate it from yellow warbler, but that is probably what it's most likely to be confused with. Yellow warbler is brighter yellow and doesn't have the facial pattern or the breast streaks, the grayish, smudgy gray breast streaks of the orange-crowned. There are a couple of other visual features that are good to think about. One is the orange-crowned warbler has a yellow undertail and a fairly dark tail. So if you're seeing the bird from below, the tail feathers will probably look grayish, but the undertail coverts will look sort of yellowish. That's important because yellow warbler has got a yellow tail. The other thing is that the orange-crowned warbler is not adverse to foraging on the trunks of trees as well as the branches. I mentioned the pale eye crescents and the faint eye stripe, but I didn't mention the supercilium. The supercilium of an orange-crowned warbler can be pretty pronounced. It's usually yellowish. Moving on to yellow warbler, this is actually a really abundant migrant in our area. It's a sparse breeder in Santa Clara County, but it certainly seems common during fall migration. So you'll notice a few things that are different about this bird. One is it's a brighter yellow. Two is it lacks the strong facial pattern, no supercilium, no eye stripe. In fact, it has what we call a plain yellow face. That's actually one of Stokes' distinctive marks that they want us to pay attention to. And while the orange-crowned warbler didn't have wing bars, at least not obvious wing bars, the yellow warbler has faint yellow wing bars. So it is quite different. It tends to be brighter than orange-crowned and a very plain looking. That dark eye kind of sits in the middle of its bright yellow face and looks quite different. The thing to remember is that juveniles and females are not always the bright yellow. Sometimes they appear to be almost whitish, pale gray, not much color at all, especially for the very young birds. But the very expressionless face with very few marks, just a big black eye right in the middle of a pale face, that's usually a good mark. Also look at the undertail and the tail itself. The undertail is yellow. The webbing, the inner webbing of the tail feathers is yellow. So that's actually quite unique among our warblers, and hopefully that's something that you'd be able to see. Neither orange-crowned nor yellow warblers have got marks on the tail, but they both have distinctive colors to the tail. If you're lucky enough to see a Wilson's warbler, male, there should be no confusion. With the black cap, the bright yellow breast, and the greenish back, it's pretty obvious, pretty distinctive. But if you see a female or an immature in fall, it could be a little bit more confusing. Unlike the yellow warbler, though, the Wilson's warbler doesn't have a yellow tail. From the underside, it appears fairly gray. But like the yellow warbler, it has a yellow undertail. So it's a fairly compact warbler, remaining fairly low in the trees and in the shrubs. Very similar, in fact, to orange-crowned warbler in its habitat preference. The yellow warbler tends to perch a little bit higher and can be seen quite a bit higher in a tree. Wilson's warbler stays low, and it does prefer thickets and willows and things of that sort. You might notice also that Wilson's warbler doesn't show any hint of wing bars. Yellowish wing bars are sort of a hallmark of yellow warbler. Wilson's, on the other hand, is pretty uniform on the upper parts. Townsend's warbler is one of those birds that makes East Coasters jealous. It's a beautiful, flashy, showy bird from the West, and it's one of our most beloved birds in California. It is truly a treetop species, so you're unlikely to see it low to the ground unless it's on the move. If it's moving from place to place, if it's on migration, it might very well come down to feed in apple orchards or other places where it can find insects close to the ground. But oftentimes you see it in the upper branches. It has bright white wing bars and streaks. On the male, it's got a yellow breast and a flashy black and yellow face. Females and immatures are much less showy, but they still have a pretty pronounced facial pattern. Townsend's warbler is pretty much unmistakable in our area, but one thing that's interesting to note is that its call note is pretty high and sibilant. So if you can recognize the call note, you can pick out Townsend's warblers in a crowd of other warblers. It has pretty distinctive, high-pitched smacking call, quite unlike the yellow-rumped warbler, which we'll discuss next. Like yellow-rumped warbler, the Townsend's warbler is mostly a winter species in our area. You may find holdouts during the summer months up along Skyline Boulevard and in the coniferous areas, but for the most part, Townsend's warbler is here during winter. And they're pretty easy to recognize, and it's one of our favorites for the area. If you've been to the Sierra during spring or summer, you're familiar with the flashy plumage of yellow-rumped warbler. The males are blue-gray with brilliant yellow breast and throat and crown. They're flashy and showy, and they're just spectacular. But by the time we see them in the winter, fall and winter in the Bay Area, they're much drabber. They've lost their flashy blue-gray plumage. The females are fairly brown and streaky. They don't look like much. And I know that sounds bad, but they're just not nearly as gorgeous, shall we say, in fall and winter. Nevertheless, they're hugely abundant in the area during the winter months, and they'll start to show up in our area pretty soon. Now, you'll never hear me use the nickname that a lot of people do for this bird, the butterbutt. I've never liked that, but I always call them yellow-rumped warblers. And when I notice the difference between an Audubon's yellow-rumped warbler or a Myrtle yellow-rumped warbler, I might call them Audubon's warbler or Myrtle warbler. Those two categories belong to the same species. They're sort of regional variations. The eastern birds tend to be more of the Myrtle sort with the white throat. The western individuals tend to be the Audubon group with the yellow throat. But we do get both kinds here, and during fall, we see a lot of both. When you do come across yellow-rumped warbler in the fall, you'll start to notice the streaky brown plumage, and if nothing else, you'll find that yellow rump really jumps out, especially on the adults. The young birds, the yellow rump is present, but not quite as obvious, not quite as bright. Yellow-rumped warbler is a fly-catching species, so you'll see them sallying out of the trees in the open air, trying to catch insects in midair. They'll be feeding on the ground, they'll be feeding in the branches, they'll be feeding in the bushes. So they're kind of a generalist warbler, in fact, and they find them pretty much every place you can go when you step outside your door in winter. They're everywhere. If you get used to their whick call, you'll start to notice it all over the place, at the car wash, at the grocery store, at the parking lot, at your place of work, in your driveway. Yellow-rumped warblers are really abundant during our fall and winter months here. Now, I said I was going to talk about the common birds, common warblers in our area, but I thought I would throw in one kind of semi-rarity. Palm warbler is the rarest of the bunch for this video. You'll notice that it has some of the same streakiness as a yellow-rumped warbler, but if you recall, Yellow-rumped warbler had a pretty plain, expressionless face. The supercilium was quite small. There were no pronounced markings on the face. Palm warbler is quite different. It has a very pronounced eye stripe and a very pronounced supercilium and a very contrasty pale throat. But it shares the streaks on the breast of yellow-rumped warblers, and it shares the kind of brownish, tannish, streaky coloration. The thing that's interesting and different about palm warbler is that it spends most of its time on the ground. You can find this bobbing around on the ground, searching for insects in the grass and such. Now, it does fly into the trees, of course, but you'd be surprised how much time it spends on the ground. And when it does move on the ground, it'll be bobbing its tail up and down, kind of like a water thrush, if you're familiar with that. But they'll bob their tail up and down in an almost comical fashion. The undertail cover is very, very pronounced yellow. And unfortunately, they do have a yellowish rump, which when they fly can be pretty obvious. But don't mistake this for yellow-rumped warbler. It doesn't have any of the blue-gray coloration, none of the gray plumage coloration, in fact. It's all kind of brownish and streaky. It looks rather like a thrush. It has fairly bright white outer tail feathers too, so if you do see it flying, watch that tail. See if you can catch a glimpse of those contrasting white outer tail feathers. I said palm warbler was the rarest of the group of the warblers that we discussed in this video. That is true, but to give you a sense of how rare it is, we can get anywhere between 1 and possibly 3 palm warblers in the county in fall. And some of them actually remain through the winter. There was a palm warbler at Bixby Park last fall and winter, and it remained for quite a while. So people were able to see it fairly predictably over near the water treatment plant. So watch for the palm warbler in areas where there's grassy thickets, many fennel for them to forage in. They don't mind perching in trees, of course, but they do spend a lot of time low to the ground. So listen for that, watch for that, and listen for the somewhat different chip note. I can't overemphasize how important it is to start listening to chip notes because every warbler has a fairly distinctive chip note. And I won't pretend to recognize them all, but I can usually tell when something is different. And if you're watching a bunch of yellow-rumped warblers, and maybe an occasional orange crown warbler, or a Wilson's warbler, or a yellow warbler during fall migration, get to listen to each of those chip notes and get used to recognize them. See if you can recognize them. And if you hear something different, stop what you're doing and try to find what it is that sounds different. Chances are there's a reason it sounds different. Could be a palm warbler. Before we get going, I wanted to mention a few places that are really good to look for warblers during the fall migration season. The first one is one of my favorites. It's very close to my home in Mountain View, Charleston Marsh. It's right on the Google campus off of Shoreline Boulevard. And in this area, you'll find a creek setting, which is choked with willows and other wonderful riparian plants. There's a short boardwalk that goes out into the center of the marsh. And from this area, you can scan the trees, the shrubs, the willows for warblers of various kinds, Nashville, Townsend's, even palm. This is one of the most famous places to search for northern water thrush. Every fall, for many years, northern water thrush showed up in this area, and people were getting pretty good looks at it. So explore this area. Keep in mind that warblers are drawn to trees that host lots of insects, and willows are just that kind of tree. The area is richly grown with lots of plants, and there's been some interesting restoration here. So it's a beautiful habitat, and recently has produced lots of great reports of fall warblers. Another fantastic place to go for fall warblers is Sunnyvale Baylands Park. This is located off of Highway 237 in Sunnyvale, and we're looking at this grove of trees that leads from the parking lot to the bay. It's about an eighth of a mile in length, and the flowering eucalyptus trees here and the cottonwood trees have attracted scores of interesting warblers over the years. Birds like chestnut-sided warbler, palm warbler, pine warbler, pretty much any warbler you want to see can be found here. Canada warbler was found here. Don't forget to check the playground across the meadow. Tons of trees here. Plan on spending a couple of hours. The last area I want to talk about is Eula-Stack Natural Area in Santa Clara. This is a fairly small preserve. It's characterized by a lot of native plant restoration, but there are also large groves of eucalyptus trees, many of which flower during winter, and lots of cottonwoods, lots of willows, lots of coyote bush. So there's a great variety of plant communities and habitats here. Plan on spending at least an hour here to explore the various study areas. They're all numbered. And you'll find that some days it's very active and some days not so much. Tanagers, orioles, any number of fall migrants come through here, different kinds of flycatchers. But recently it's been a great hot spot, a great destination for birders to find fall warblers. So enjoy this beautiful area and go out and search for some warblers.